I'll never forget the moment I saw Mama's face. Her hands trembled as she clutched the side of the clay pot she had been washing, her lips opening and closing like she wanted to say something but couldn't. "What did you just say?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. At first, I didn't understand her reaction. I had just told her the name of the man I saw at the village celebration the day before, Chief Olamide, my cousin Abike's husband. But I also mentioned something else, something that seemed normal to me at the time. "Chief Olamide brought his new wife," I had said. "She's beautiful, Mama. Everyone's talking about her. I think her name is Adunni." But she looked uncomfortable. Mama's reaction was swift and startling. She froze, and the pot slipped from her hands, crashing to the ground. The sound startled the goats grazing nearby. "What did you say her name was?" she repeated, her eyes wide. That was the moment I knew something was terribly wrong. It all started 2 months earlier when the village was abuzz with news of the chief's new wife. Chief Olamide was known for his wealth and influence. He was a man who could marry any woman he wanted, and he had done so several times. This new wife, however, was different. Rumors flew about how young and beautiful she was, how she had come from a neighboring town, and how her family had insisted on a quiet ceremony to avoid unnecessary attention. When I first saw her at the celebration, I understood why people couldn't stop talking about her. Adunni was stunning, with smooth, dark skin and eyes that seemed to hold a story no one could quite figure out. She didn't smile much, though. She sat stiffly by the chief's side, her hands folded in her lap, looking more like a guest than a bride. I didn't think much of it at first. Many young women felt shy or nervous after marrying into such a prominent family. But now, seeing Mama's reaction, I began to wonder if there was more to Adunni's story than anyone knew. Later that evening, Mama couldn't stop pacing. She kept muttering to herself, shaking her head and wringing her hands. Finally, she sat me down by the fire and spoke in a voice so low I had to lean in to hear her. "There's something I never told you," she began. "Something I hoped I would never have to say." I was confused. "What is it, Mama?" She looked into the flames for a long time before answering. "Adunni is my daughter. My first child. Before I married your father." My mouth fell open. "What?" Mama's story poured out in fragments, each word heavier than the last. Before she married my father, she had fallen in love with a man from another village. They had a child together, Adunni. But the man's family disapproved of the relationship, and Mama had been forced to leave, taking the baby with her. She eventually met my father and started a new life, leaving her past behind. "I never told anyone," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Not even your father. I didn't think I'd ever see her again. I didn't know what to say. The chief's new wife was my half-sister? How was that even possible? And why hadn't Mama said something sooner?" But before I could ask any of these questions, Mama dropped another bombshell. "There's something else," she said, her voice shaking. "I think Chief Olamide is her father." The air seemed to leave the room. I stared at her, unable to process what I had just heard. Her father? But how? Mama shook her head. "I don't know for sure," she admitted. "But the timing, the way his family reacted back then, it all fits. And if it's true..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. If Adunni had unknowingly married her own father, it would be a scandal unlike anything our village had ever seen. More than that, it would be a curse. Our traditions were clear. Such unions were forbidden, and anyone who broke this rule would bring misfortune upon themselves and everyone around them. "We have to find out the truth," Mama said firmly, wiping her tears, "before it's too late." Over the next few days, Mama and I began piecing together the story. She told me everything she remembered about her past with Adunni's father, his name, his family, and the circumstances of their separation. I listened carefully, trying to make sense of it all. Meanwhile, the village continued to buzz with gossip about the chief's new wife. Some people said she was too quiet, that she didn't behave like a proper bride. Others claimed they had seen her crying alone near the river. No one knew why, but everyone had an opinion. Mama and I kept our suspicions to ourselves. We didn't want to spread rumors until we had proof. But the more we uncovered, the more convinced we became that Mama's worst fear was true. Finally, Mama made a decision. "We need to talk to Adunni," she said. face to face. She deserves to know the truth. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. I had no idea how we were going to pull this off. The chief's compound was heavily guarded, and visitors were rarely allowed inside. But Mama was determined, and I knew better than to argue with her when she was like this. As we prepared to leave, Mama turned to me with a look I'll never forget. "No matter what happens," she said, "this will change everything." She was right. The next morning, we set out early, just as the sun was rising. Mama wore her best wrapper, the one she only brought out for weddings and funerals. Her face was calm, but I could see her hands trembling as she tied her headscarf. I wasn't sure if it was fear or determination that drove her. The chief's compound sat on a hill overlooking the village. It was an intimidating sight, with its high walls and heavy wooden gate. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their spears glinting in the sunlight. Mama took a deep breath and approached them. "I need to see a dunny," she said firmly. The guards exchanged a glance. "The chief's wife doesn't take visitors," one of them said. Mama didn't back down. "Tell her it's her mother. She'll understand." I held my breath, waiting to see what they would do. The guards hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Finally, one of them disappeared inside. A few minutes later, he returned and nodded. "She'll see you," he said. We were led through the compound, past the chief's many wives and children, who stared at us curiously. My heart raced as we entered a small room where a dunny sat, her hands folded in her lap. She looked even more beautiful up close, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made my chest tighten. When she saw Mama, her face lit up with recognition. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mama rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. For a moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay. But then Mama pulled back and looked her in the eye. "Adunny, we need to talk," she said. "There's something you need to know." Adunny frowned, her gaze flickering to me. "Who is this?" she asked. "This is your sister," Mama said softly. Adunny's eyes widened. "My sister?" Mama nodded. "And there's more. Adunny, do you know who your father is?" Adunny looked confused. "Of course," she said. "You told me he was from another village, but I never met him." Mama hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I think your father might be Chief Olamide," she said finally. The room fell silent. Adunny stared at Mama, her face pale. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Mama reached for her hand. "I don't know for sure," she said, "but there are too many coincidences. The timing, the way his family treated me. Adunny, we need to find out the truth." Adunny pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "No," she said firmly. "This can't be true. It's impossible," but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The next few days were a blur. Adunny agreed to help us uncover the truth, but she insisted on being discreet. "If anyone finds out about this, it will ruin everything," she said. We started by gathering as much information as we could about Chief Olamide's past. Adunny managed to sneak into the chief's study one night and found an old family ledger. It contained the names of all his wives and children, along with dates of marriages and births. What we found confirmed our worst fears. The dates lined up perfectly. Chief Olamide had been involved with Mama around the same time Adunny was born. Still, we needed more proof. Mama suggested we speak to the chief's eldest wife, who had been with him the longest and knew all his secrets. Adunny was reluctant at first, but she eventually agreed. "It's the only way to be sure," Mama said. Meeting the eldest wife was no easy task. She rarely left her quarters and was known for being fiercely loyal to the chief. But Adunny convinced her to speak with us by pretending she needed advice about her new role as a wife. When we finally sat down with her, Mama wasted no time. "We need to know about the chief's past," she said. "Specifically, about a woman he was involved with many years ago." The eldest wife raised an eyebrow. "Why do you ask?" Mama hesitated, then told her everything about her past with the chief, about Adunny, and about her suspicions. The eldest wife listened carefully, her expression unreadable. When Mama finished, she sighed and shook her head. "I always knew this man's past would catch up with him," she said. My heart raced. "So it's true?" I asked. The eldest wife nodded. "I remember hearing about a woman from another village," she said. The family didn't approve, so they forced him to end it. But I never knew there was a child. Adunni looked like she was about to faint. What do we do now? She whispered. The eldest wife sighed again. You need to tell the chief, she said. He deserves to know the truth. That night, Adunni wrestled with the decision. She was terrified of what would happen if the truth came out. But she also knew she couldn't live with this secret forever. Finally, she made up her mind. I'll tell him tomorrow, she said. But as we left the compound, a shadowy figure stepped out from behind a tree. It was one of the chief's guards. I heard everything, he said. My blood ran cold. The guard stepped closer, his face partially hidden in the moonlight. His voice was low and firm, but there was a trace of something else. Hesitation, maybe fear. You think you can bring this kind of shame to the chief and walk away from it, he said. Adunni's breath caught, and she instinctively moved closer to Mama and me. We're not trying to cause trouble, Mama said, her voice steady. We're just trying to find the truth. The guard scoffed. The truth? Do you know what will happen if this gets out? You'll destroy his name, his legacy. The elders will call for punishment, not just for him, but for all of you. Do you want that kind of blood on your hands? I glanced at Mama, hoping she would tell him to leave, but her face was unreadable. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward. We don't want to hurt anyone, she said. But this is bigger than the chief's reputation. This is about what's right. The guard shook his head. You don't understand, he said. If you go through with this, you'll bring a curse on the entire village. People won't forgive you for that. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the distant chirping of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, to my surprise, Adunni stepped forward. I didn't ask for any of this, she said, her voice trembling but firm. But I won't live a lie. If the chief is my father, he needs to know. The guard's eyes narrowed. Then you leave me no choice, he said. The next morning, the entire village was buzzing with rumors. Someone had leaked the story, though we didn't know who. All we knew was that by midday, nearly everyone was talking about the chief's new wife and the scandal that threatened to destroy his household. Mama and I stayed inside, too afraid to show our faces. But Adunni insisted on going to the chief herself. He deserves to hear it from me, she said. Mama tried to stop her, but Adunni wouldn't listen. I can't hide forever, she said. If this is going to ruin everything, I need to face it head on. So we watched as she walked out of the house, her head held high despite the whispers and stares that followed her. When Adunni finally reached the chief's compound, she was stopped by the same guard who had threatened us the night before. This time, though, he looked less confident. His eyes darted around nervously, as if he was afraid someone might see him. You shouldn't be here, he said. I need to see the chief, Adunni replied. The guard hesitated, then stepped aside. Do what you must, he muttered. Adunni entered the compound, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the chief in his private quarters, sitting on a low stool and staring into the distance. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening. My beautiful wife, he said. What brings you here? Adunni's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. I need to talk to you about something important, she said. The chief frowned. What is it? Adunni took a deep breath. I think you might be my father. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. For a moment, the chief didn't react. Then, slowly, he stood up, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. What did you say? He asked, his voice low. Adunni repeated herself, her voice steadier this time. I think you might be my father, she said. My mother told me everything. The chief stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. Adunni didn't know what to do. She waited for what felt like hours, but the chief didn't return. Finally, one of his other wives came to find her. He's called a meeting with the elders, the woman said. You should go home. Adunni nodded, her legs trembling as she made her way back to our house. When she arrived, she collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. He didn't even say anything, she sobbed. He just left. Mama knelt beside her, holding her tightly. It's going to be okay, she whispered. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But deep down, I could see the fear in Mama's eyes. None of us knew what the chief would do, or how the village would react when they found out the truth. That evening, the sound of a gong echoed through the village, signaling an emergency meeting in the town square. Mama and I stayed behind, but Adunni insisted on going. "I need to know what they're saying," she said. We watched from a distance as the villagers gathered, their faces lit by the glow of torches. The chief stood in the center, surrounded by the elders. His voice was calm, but firm as he spoke, addressing the rumors that had spread like wildfire. "I have called you here to discuss a matter of great importance," he began. "There are accusations against me that cannot be ignored." The crowd murmured, their whispers carrying through the night. Adunni stepped closer, straining to hear every word. "The truth is," the chief hesitated, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Then finally he spoke. "The truth is, I don't know." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "What does that mean?" one of the elders demanded. The chief sighed. "I was involved with a woman from another village many years ago," he admitted. "But I never knew she had a child. If what she says is true." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. The crowd erupted into chaos, some people shouting in anger, others whispering in shock. Adunni stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, one of the elders raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "This is a grave matter," he said. "We must determine the truth before we can decide what to do." The chief nodded. "I agree," he said. "But until then, I ask for your patience and understanding." The meeting ended soon after, but the tension in the air was palpable. As the crowd dispersed, Adunni made her way back to us, her face pale but determined. "They're going to investigate," she said. "They won't let this go." Mama nodded, her expression grim. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next," she said. The village had never been so restless. People whispered in the markets, at the stream, and in the fields. Everyone had an opinion, and none of it was kind. Some said Adunni had brought shame to the chief's household. Others blamed Mama for digging up old secrets. Everywhere we turned, we felt the weight of their stares and judgment. But the real storm began when the elders started their investigation. They were the final authority in matters like this, men known for their wisdom and ability to judge fairly. They announced they would summon everyone involved, gather evidence, and consult the ancestors before giving their verdict. "They will call me first," Mama said one evening, her voice heavy with dread. "I'll have to tell them everything." Adunni sat across from her, silent and tense. "What if they punish us?" she asked. "What if they say we're cursed?" Mama reached for her hand. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," she said. But even as she spoke, I could see the fear in her eyes. The elders began their investigation with Mama. She was summoned to the chief's compound early in the morning. I watched from the doorway as she adjusted her wrapper and tied her headscarf tightly, like armor for the battle ahead. "Don't worry," she said to us. "I'll tell them the truth." When she returned later that afternoon, her face was pale, and her shoulders slumped as if she carried the weight of the world. "What did they say?" I asked. Mama shook her head. "They asked me everything. How I met the chief, what happened between us, why I never told anyone about Adunni." She sighed deeply. "They didn't say much, just nodded and told me to leave." "Do you think they believed you?" Adunni asked. Mama hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. Next, the elders called the chief. This time, the entire village gathered near the square, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening. We couldn't hear what was being said, but the chief's booming voice carried through the air, filled with anger and frustration. "I didn't know," he shouted at one point. "How could I have known?" The elders listened calmly, their faces unreadable. When the chief finally stormed out of the meeting, he didn't look at anyone. He disappeared into his compound and didn't emerge for the rest of the day. The rumors spread quickly. Some said the chief had admitted to being with Mama all those years ago. Others claimed he denied everything. But no one knew for sure what was true and what wasn't. Then it was Adunni's turn. She was shaking as we walked her to the elder's hut, her hands gripping mine so tightly I thought my fingers might break. "You don't have to do this," I whispered. "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "I need to know." She disappeared inside, leaving Mama and me to wait outside under the blazing sun. The minutes felt like hours, and every sound from the hut made my heart race. Finally, the door opened, and a dunny stepped out. Her face was a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They asked about my childhood, she said, about Mama, and whether I remembered anything about my father. I told them the truth, that I don't. Mama nodded. You did well, she said, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The elders were gathering all the pieces of the puzzle, but none of us knew what picture they would put together. The final part of the investigation was the most daunting, consulting the ancestors. The elders announced they would perform a divination ceremony to seek guidance from the spirits. It was a sacred and solemn process, one that would determine not just the truth but also the consequences. The ceremony was held at the sacred grove, a place deep in the forest where only the elders were allowed to go. They carried offerings of kola nuts, palm wine, and a white goat, which they said would be used to appease the ancestors. The village held its breath as the elders disappeared into the forest. For hours, we waited, unsure of what they would find or what they would decide. When the elders finally returned, their faces were grave. The head elder raised his hand, silencing the crowd. The ancestors have spoken, he said, and their message is clear. The next morning, the village gathered in the square for the announcement. The atmosphere was tense, and the air felt thick with anticipation. A dunny stood beside Mama and me, her hands trembling. The head elder stepped forward, his voice loud and steady. We have consulted the ancestors, he began, and they have revealed the truth. The crowd leaned in, hanging on his every word. It is true that Chief Olamide and this woman, he gestured toward Mama, were once together. And it is also true that a child was born of their union. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I felt a dunny's grip tighten on my arm. But the ancestors have also shown us something else, the elder continued. This union was not meant to be. It goes against the natural order and has brought a great imbalance. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some of anger, others of fear. The elder raised his hand again, calling for silence. The chief must renounce this union immediately, he said. And the woman, a dunny, must leave his household. She cannot remain as his wife. A dunny's face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Mama pulled her close, whispering words of comfort that I couldn't hear. But that is not all, the elder said, his voice heavy. The ancestors have warned of consequences. The chief must perform a cleansing ritual to restore balance to the village. If he refuses, the curse will remain. The chief, who had been standing silently until now, stepped forward. I will do whatever is necessary, he said. But know this, I never meant for any of this to happen. The elder nodded. Intentions do not change the truth, he said. As the crowd dispersed, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The truth was finally out, but it had come at a cost. A dunny was no longer welcome in the chief's household, and the weight of the scandal would follow all of us for the rest of our lives. But Mama held her head high as we walked home. We did the right thing, she said. No matter what anyone says, I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The cleansing ritual was scheduled for the following week, and the entire village was expected to attend. The chief himself had requested it be done publicly, perhaps as a way to show his remorse or reclaim his tarnished honor. But for Mama, a dunny, and me, the week dragged by like a storm cloud that refused to move, heavy and ominous. A dunny barely spoke. She spent most of her time in her room, staring at the wall or sitting by the window. I wanted to comfort her, to say something that might make things easier, but what could I say? She had lost everything, her husband, her status, her future. Mama, on the other hand, busied herself with chores, though it was clear her mind was elsewhere. We'll get through this, she said one evening as we sat by the fire. We've already survived so much. This is just one more trial. But even as she spoke, I could see the worry in her eyes. The village hadn't forgiven her, and I doubted they ever would. On the day of the ritual, the village square was packed. The elders stood at the center, surrounded by drummers, dancers, and the chief's wives and children. A large wooden altar had been built, draped in white cloth and adorned with cowrie shells, feathers, and palm fronds. Mama and I stayed at the edge of the crowd, but Adunni stood closer, her head covered with a scarf. She wanted to see everything, even if it hurt. When the chief arrived, the crowd fell silent. He wore a white agbada embroidered with gold, a stark contrast to the grim expression on his face. He walked slowly to the altar, where the head elder stood waiting. "The ancestors have demanded this ritual to restore balance," the elder announced. "Today, we cleanse the chief, his household, and this village of the shame and misfortune that have befallen us." The crowd murmured in agreement, though I noticed a few people casting glances at Mama and Adunni. The ritual began with a series of prayers and chants, calling on the spirits to forgive the chief and protect the village from harm. The drummers played a steady rhythm, their hands moving in perfect synchronization. Then came the sacrifices. A white goat was brought forward, its legs tied with raffia. The head elder said a prayer over it, then handed the knife to the chief. Chief Olamide hesitated, his hand trembling as he took the knife. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't go through with it. But then he closed his eyes and made the cut. The goat let out a final cry before collapsing to the ground. The crowd erupted into cheers, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. The sight of the blood pooling on the ground made my stomach churn. Next, the elders brought out a calabash filled with a dark liquid. They dipped a bundle of leaves into it and sprinkled the liquid over the chief's head, muttering incantations as they did so. Finally, the head elder raised his hand. "The ritual is complete," he declared. "The curse is lifted." The crowd cheered again, but the chief looked anything but relieved. He turned to the elders, his voice low but firm. "What about Adunni?" he asked. "What happens to her?" The head elder frowned. "She has already been removed from your household," he said. "That is all the ancestors require." Chief Olamide nodded, though his jaw was clenched. He didn't look at Adunni as he walked away. As the crowd dispersed, Adunni remained where she was, staring at the altar. Mama and I approached her, but she didn't look at us. "It's over," she said quietly. Mama placed a hand on her shoulder. "Not yet," she said. "We still have to rebuild." Adunni finally turned to face us, her eyes filled with tears. "Rebuild what?" she asked. "I've lost everything." "No," Mama said firmly. "You still have me. You still have your sister. And you still have your future. Don't let this define you." Adunni didn't respond, but she let Mama pull her into an embrace. I stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do or say. Over the next few days, the village slowly returned to normal. The gossip faded, replaced by news stories and scandals. But for our family, things would never be the same. Adunni decided to leave the village and return to the town where she had grown up. "I need a fresh start," she said. "Somewhere I can build a new life without all of this hanging over me." Mama tried to convince her to stay, but Adunni was determined. "I'll visit," she promised. "But I can't stay here. Not after everything that's happened." The morning she left, Mama and I walked her to the edge of the village. She carried only a small bag, her head held high despite the stares of the villagers. As she hugged us goodbye, I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Take care of yourself," I said. She smiled faintly. "You too." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing down the dusty road. That night, as Mama and I sat by the fire, she spoke for the first time about the pain she had carried for so many years. "I made mistakes," she said. "I let my fear and shame keep me from telling the truth. And in the end, it hurt everyone I wanted to protect." I reached for her hand. "You were just trying to do what was best," I said. Mama nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears. "I hope Adunni finds peace," she said. "And I hope one day this village will forgive us." I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, holding her hand as the fire crackled and the night grew darker. The days turned into weeks after Adunni left, and though life seemed to return to normal for the rest of the village, it felt like everything had changed for us. Mama rarely went to the market anymore, and when she did, the women whispered behind her back, their voices barely masked. I could see the weight of their judgment in the way Mama's shoulders drooped when she returned home. "Let them talk," she would say, her voice firm but tired. They don't know our story. But their words stung, even if she pretended they didn't. As for me, I kept to myself, avoiding the places where gossip was loudest. I missed Dunny terribly, and the house felt empty without her. Sometimes I wondered if leaving with her would have been easier, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon Mama. She needed me now more than ever. One evening, as we sat by the fire, a knock came at the door. Mama and I exchanged a glance before she got up to answer it. Standing outside was one of the elders, a man named Baba Adebayo, known for his kindness and wisdom. "Mama Dunny," he said, his tone gentle. "May I come in?" Mama hesitated, then stepped aside to let him enter. He sat on the stool near the fire, his walking stick resting across his lap. "I've come to speak with you," he said. Mama nodded, though her hands fidgeted with the edge of her wrapper. "What is it, Baba?" Baba Adebayo sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the flames. "The village has been hard on you," he said. "I've seen how they look at you, how they speak about you. It isn't right." Mama looked down, her eyes glistening. "I made mistakes," she said. "I understand their anger." "No," Baba Adebayo said firmly. "You told the truth. That takes courage. Many would have buried this secret and let it rot in the dark. But you chose to face it, even knowing the cost." Mama didn't respond, but I could see her shoulders relax slightly. "The chief has completed his cleansing ritual," Baba Adebayo continued. "The ancestors are satisfied. Now it is time for the village to move on, and for you to heal." Mama raised her head, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "How can I heal when everyone looks at me like I'm a curse?" Baba Adebayo smiled faintly. "You start by forgiving yourself," he said. "The rest will follow." He stood, leaning on his stick as he prepared to leave. "And remember this," he said. "The truth may bring pain, but it also brings freedom. Hold on to that." After he left, Mama sat quietly for a long time, staring into the fire. I didn't interrupt her. I knew she was processing his words, letting them sink into the cracks of her wounded heart. Weeks later, we received a letter from Dunny. It was the first time we'd heard from her since she left, and Mama's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was short, but filled with hope. Dunny wrote that she had found a small room to rent in the town and had started working at a tailor's shop. "I'm learning so much," she wrote. "The woman who owns the shop says I have a talent for it. I think I might even start making my own designs soon." Mama's eyes filled with tears as she read the letter aloud. For the first time in months, I saw a genuine smile on her face. "She's going to be okay," Mama said softly. I nodded. "She's strong. Just like you." Mama looked at me, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And just like you," she said. As time went on, the whispers in the village began to fade. People moved on to new gossip, new dramas, and our story became just another tale from the past. Mama started going to the market again, her head held high, and I began to feel a sense of normalcy returning to our lives. One day, as we walked back from the stream, Mama stopped and looked out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" I asked. "About starting over," she said. "Maybe we don't have to stay here. Maybe we could go somewhere new, where people don't know us, and build a different life." I was surprised but also intrigued by the idea. "Where would we go?" Mama shrugged, a small smile on her lips. "Anywhere. The world is wide, my child. We don't have to let this village define us." I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Let's do it," I said. Mama reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll leave soon," she said. "But first, let's send a letter to Dunny. She should know what we're planning." A month later, we packed our belongings and prepared to leave the village behind. As we stood at the edge of the road, I turned back one last time, taking in the familiar sights of the place I had called home my entire life. "It's hard to say goodbye," I said. Mama nodded. "It is," she said. "But sometimes goodbye is the only way to move forward." We started walking, our footsteps carrying us toward an uncertain future, but also toward hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of freedom, a chance to start anew, to build a life beyond the shadows of the past. And I knew, deep in my heart, that Dunny would be waiting for us on the other side. It had been a few months since Mama and I left the village, settling in a quiet town a day's journey away. Life had begun to feel peaceful again. Mama had started selling handmade mats at the market, and I had taken up sewing, inspired by the letters Adunni wrote about her own work as a tailor. Adunni visited us every few weeks. Each time she came, she looked brighter, stronger, and more like the sister I'd grown up with. She spoke excitedly about her designs and how she was beginning to attract customers. It was clear she was carving out a new life for herself, one stitch at a time. But one afternoon, while we were sitting outside chatting, a visitor arrived who would change everything. A young man stood at our gate, dressed sharply in a simple shirt and trousers. His skin glowed with the unmistakable mark of someone who had lived abroad, smooth, polished, and confident. But his eyes were warm and kind, and when he smiled, it was as if the sun had come out. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice deep and pleasant. "I'm looking for Adunni." We all froze. Mama and I glanced at each other, confused. Adunni stood slowly, her brows furrowed. "I'm Adunni," she said cautiously. "Who are you?" The young man chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck. "I suppose my father didn't tell you about me," he said. "My name is Oladipo. I'm Baba Adebayo's son." Adunni blinked, stunned into silence. "I just came back to the country," Oladipo continued. "I heard about everything that happened, and I wanted to meet you." Adunni frowned. "Why would you want to meet me?" Oladipo's smile softened. "Because I admire you," he said simply. "You've been through so much, but you stayed strong. My father said you're one of the bravest women he's ever met." Adunni's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, unsure of how to respond. "Can I take you out for a walk?" Oladipo asked. "Just to talk. I promise I'm not here to make things awkward." Adunni hesitated, glancing at Mama and me. Mama nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "All right," Adunni said finally. "A walk." Oladipo grinned. "Perfect." As Oladipo and Adunni walked away, Mama and I stayed behind, watching them from a distance. "He seems nice," I said, trying to gauge Mama's reaction. Mama nodded slowly. "He does," she said, "but Adunni's been hurt before. I just hope he's serious about her." Later that evening, when Adunni returned, her face was glowing. She sat down with us, clutching her hands in her lap like she was trying to contain her excitement. "So?" Mama asked, unable to hide her curiosity. Adunni smiled shyly. "He's different," she said. "He listens. He doesn't judge me for what happened with the chief. He said I'm not defined by my past." Mama's eyes softened. "And how do you feel about him?" Adunni hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's too soon to tell. But he seems kind. And for now, I think that's enough." Over the next few weeks, Oladipo became a regular presence in our lives. He visited often, always bringing gifts, fabric for Mama, books for me, and flowers for Adunni. The more time he spent with us, the clearer it became that his interest in Adunni was genuine. One evening, as we sat outside watching the sunset, Oladipo turned to Adunni and said something none of us expected. "I want to marry you," he said simply. Adunni froze, her eyes wide. "What?" Oladipo smiled. "I know it's sudden," he said, "but I've thought about it, and I know how I feel. You're everything I've been looking for. Kind, strong, intelligent. I want to build a life with you." Adunni stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't know what to say. Mama cleared her throat. "Marriage is a big decision," she said gently. "Are you sure you're ready for that, Oladipo?" Oladipo nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. Then he turned back to Adunni. "But I won't rush you. Take your time. If you're not ready, I'll wait." Adunni looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she smiled. "I'll think about it," she said. As word of Oladipo's proposal spread, the whispers started again. People from our old village, and even some in our new town, began speculating about whether Adunni would accept. Some said she didn't deserve a second chance after the scandal with the chief. Others praised Oladipo for seeing beyond her past. Mama worried about the gossip, but Adunni seemed unfazed. "I don't care what they think," she said one day. "This is my life, not theirs." Still, I could tell she was nervous. She confided in me late one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I say yes and he regrets it?" she asked. What if his family doesn't accept me? I reached for her hand. Oladipo isn't the kind of man to care about what other people think, I said. He's already shown that. And as for his family, you have nothing to prove to them. You're enough, Adunni. She nodded, though I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. A few weeks later, Adunni gave her answer. She called Oladipo to our house and met him outside under the shade of the mango tree. Mama and I stayed inside, giving them privacy, but we peeked through the window, unable to resist. I've thought about what you said, Adunni began, her voice steady. And I've decided I want to marry you. Oladipo's face lit up, his smile so wide it could have lit up the entire town. You won't regret this, he said. I promise. Adunni laughed softly, her first real laugh in what felt like forever. I'm holding you to that, she said. The wedding was small but beautiful, held under the open sky with close friends and family in attendance. Baba Adebayo performed the ceremony himself, his voice trembling with pride as he blessed their union. Mama cried through most of it, her hands clutching her handkerchief. She deserves this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded, tears streaming down my own cheeks. She does. When Oladipo and Adunni exchanged their vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. They looked at each other like they were the only two people in the world, their love shining brighter than the sun. After the wedding, Adunni and Oladipo moved to the city, where Oladipo had secured a job in finance. Adunni opened her own tailoring shop, quickly gaining a reputation for her beautiful designs. They visited us often, their laughter filling our home with joy. And each time they left, I felt a little lighter, knowing that Adunni had finally found the happiness she deserved. As for Mama and me, we continued to build our new life, free from the shadows of the past. And though the journey had been difficult, I knew one thing for certain. The truth, no matter how painful, had set us free.